So, Anthony, in today's world, we all know ransomware is a thing, right? It's not going anywhere. It's hockey sticking up. And there always are new attack vectors that ransomware is coming at us from. I mean, all the way down to having a hot mic and trying to detect keystrokes, right? So they're getting very, very creative when they're coming up with ways to infiltrate your business critical applications and data. So some top tips we just wanted to share with you guys for ransomware defense strategies and techniques. And really the first one I want to lead with is immutability. And if you've seen any of our videos that we've done in the past, Anthony and I, we always harp on immutability, but the fact of immutability not being enough, right? Because a lot of people will do immutability. A lot of people have the checkbox, worm volumes. There's different ways to implement it. So what I would like to basically add on to this is immutability with zero access. So this all starts with following the 32110 best practice rule. And I know most people watching the video likely have heard what 321 is. 3 copies of data, 2 different media types, 1 offsite. The additional 1 and 0 used to stand for air gapping, Anthony, back in the old days, which is still very relevant and critical if you have tape, architecture and infrastructure. But more recently, this is where immutability comes in. You definitely need 1 copy that's immutable, that can't be altered in any way, but you also need to get 1 offsite, and you also need to make sure there's 0 errors. And arguably the 0 errors is very critical in this overarching strategy, because if you've never tested, who cares how many copies you send to different locations if they're all corrupt, right? So testing is very critical, as part of this data protection strategy. Now, the other thing that's also critical that we mentioned just a moment ago is immutability is great, but what if you can gain access to the root subsystem and the root operating system and go in there and make modifications? Perhaps you go in there and disable immutability if you were the admin that implemented it. So there's always some potential risk if you have access to the subsystem. So one of the things here at Object First, Ootbi ships from the factory already hardened with 0 access to the command line, the root users disabled. So there's literally no possibility of either a bad actor or bad software, ransomware, infiltrating that and somehow corrupting the unit itself because it's hardened out of the gate. So Anthony, what are some additional strategies and tips that people could implement maybe outside of just data protection?
Yeah, Matt. So I'm gonna make a really weird analogy here. So let me know if this works or not. But firewalls, antivirus, endpoint detection and response. It's kind of like living in a really fancy gated neighborhood, right? Like the firewall is your gate. You want to put something up front that's going to stop known intruders from getting in. If it looks sketchy, if it feels weird, we're not going to let it through the gate. But sometimes the firewall is not enough, right? It can't keep up with every intruder because there's all kinds of different ways to get in. So the front gate doesn't always suffice. That's where your antivirus software comes in. And I liken this to just a security guard. Someone who's patrolling, they know what they need to look for, they're keeping track of the local threats and ensuring that if something known does sneak by, it's going to take action. It's going to jump right in there and actually do something about the malicious actor versus just saying, hey, don't come through the gate. Then there's your endpoint detection and response. And this is like having a helicopter and a security camera system and maybe even the National Guard show up. This is really where things kick into high gear. And it's important because while firewalls and antivirus are key and everyone should have them, whether you're a business or an individual user, endpoint protection really gets to that sort of police state mentality where we are on constant vigilant lookout for threats, both known and unknown. We're actually looking for things that might not be reported, patterns, looking for funny file anomalies that don't match typical utilization and usage, things that might not even be malicious. We're going to flag and potentially even quarantine to ensure that that damage isn't done, even if it's not harmful. It's good to be a little bit overzealous, and that's exactly what your endpoint detection response is going to do. It's going to be that overzealous sort of military approach that's just not going to let anything through because we understand how important the business is to maintain, and it's better to err on the side of caution than to potentially let something malicious in. Now, Matt, let's assume you've got all these set up. What about email?
Yeah, well, I love your analogy, and all I can think about is how many times have we been at a gate using your security gate analogy? It opens, it hangs open for 60 seconds or 2 minutes, and you're like, well, I'll just drive them through.
That's right.
There's always holes in firewalls, right? You can't have a 100% ironclad firewall. And for me, when you think about email security, best practices, this would circumvent all those safeguards, right? Because essentially, using your same analogy, now you've reached the apartment or the condo and you're on your computer. All it takes is one email click to go somewhere on the web and you're infiltrated. So they didn't even have to bypass the firewall and all the other things you just talked about, right? So I feel like email is one of the most common ways that bad software makes its way into the ecosystem. And it just comes down to being awareness, being aware from an employee standpoint. And some of the common tactics that I've personally seen is you always have to check the suffix from the sender's email address. And a lot of times in these modern email platforms is it'll auto enumerate the name. So you might see John Smith, but if you double click on John Smith, it might say John Smith at AOL292.com or something that is totally bogus. And that's not where the sender originated from, the one at least. So I feel like that is step one. Be vigilant when you get emails from potentially unknown sources, and even from known sources. If it looks a little off, always investigate that suffix. I feel like that is fundamentally the number one thing to always check. And a little bit of a side note too, this also goes beyond email. This could be text messages nowadays, like SMS messages. If you don't have them saved in your phone book and they show up and it looks suspect, make sure you check the number, right? Because that's another thing, that's been happening a lot is, email is definitely a very common one, but I feel like text messaging and phishing that way is becoming even more common. So what about, employee awareness, and what can we do, Anthony, to try to avoid some of these pitfalls?
It's a good question, Matt. And I was just thinking as you were explaining the email to keep up with the analogy, it's just like having a suspicious package or letter delivered to your home, right? Like, hey, you going to open that? Well, why would you open that email? And to your point, I think, and we even did a little walk and talk short on this on our YouTube channel. It is super critical that you consider not just your IT staff or the folks that are doing the more technical work in your organization, but if they have a laptop, if they connect to your corporate network, if they have an email in your 365 account, they need to be cybersecurity trained. And they don't need to go gung-ho. We don't need to understand every single certification and attack vector out there, but there needs to be a generic set of awareness and instruction that every single employee in the business owns. Not just because it's good for the business, but it's good for them as well. Being proactive and learning this stuff can benefit their home life as well. And that is an attack vector that ransomware will go through to get to your business. Believe it or not, home accounts, personal accounts are great ways to get into corporate accounts. Shared passwords, maybe they're on a shared laptop, they're on the corporate network temporarily. Any of those vectors is an entryway in. So good training and cybersecurity awareness is key, and it is for every single employee in the business. Now, Matt, I think there's one or two more things we got to consider, and one of them is really big for me. Tell us all about updating.
Yeah, so updates are obviously critical, and we're not talking about the Windows update that obviously happens right before you need to do some major work and reboots happen. So we're not talking about that. But when you look at updates specifically for security patches, this is really where it's super critical to make sure the updates are done regularly, because, a virus scanner and malware scanner, they're only as good as their definitions. And there's going to be new attempts. There's going to be new software that comes out. And if you don't update, once a week or once a month, guess what? That's a huge gap in it's almost like putting on blinders for the virus scanner because it has no idea what to look for. So keeping software and your systems updated regular, Anthony, I think is fundamental, because, again, there's no 100% ironclad firewall or virus scanner. There's always 0-day threats out there, which is why immutability and all the other things are critical that we talk about. But if you're just looking for tips on ways that you can at least try to reduce the possibility of being compromised, just keep the stuff updated. Whether it's your local machine, your business systems, just keep all the updates flowing, because what I see most commonly, Anthony, with updates, it's not big feature updates. It's not we're updating Windows or whatever operating system. It's security definitions, and they always roll almost daily. So make sure you keep that flowing.
Absolutely correct. And, Matt, just one more thing, thinking along the lines of updates, it's actually going off and testing this stuff, building a recovery plan and putting it to the test, right? I think everyone is aware of the fact they need to back up their data. I hope they're aware now, if they've watched any of our videos, they need immutable storage. Yeah. But I think the buck stops there a little far too often. We have to consider what is actually going to be required in an attack scenario when everything gets locked down. If I lose access to my backup software, if I lose access to my network, if I lose access to my ability to communicate with my peers, what do you do? And the only way you can figure that out is by building a recovery plan and actually running through the test scenario. Taking the time to simulate the lockdown, running through an actual recovery, seeing how long it takes, seeing what data goes where, figuring out how long it takes to bring everything back up online. It's intense, it's rigorous, it's tedious, but unfortunately, it's the only way you can truly know that you're ransomware ready. And it's probably one of the most important things you can do as a large organization that's doing business to ensure that you can actually recover when the attack hits.
So Anthony, how many times have tests been carried out and there's a DNS problem? I feel like this is, I start twitching when I think about tests and DNS. Like you think all your ducks are in a row and you've got all these planned, run books, and we're going to bring these VMs on in this order, and we're going to do this, that, and the other thing. And then DNS fails and you can't communicate with anything from the outside world. So this is just one key example on why testing, to your point, Anthony, is absolutely critical, because it's more than just testing and recovery. And I think it's important to delineate what you're talking about too. When we talk about sure backup and the 0 in the 32110 testing, all we're talking about is making sure that the VM or machine can power on and is responding properly. That's it. We're not talking about a holistic, let's fire up, this entire cluster at a DR site and make sure that if we go to the local Starbucks, we can still access the web server. That's what you're talking about. So there's testing at different levels, but testing is absolutely paramount at all levels, because when you get hit, exactly like what you're talking about, you're going to need to put, rubber to the road and bring things up in your disaster recovery scenario. And if communication's down, what then, right? It's almost like you never planned for it. So testing is absolutely critical. And, one of the things to kind of close on this, Anthony, is you can certainly strengthen your ransomware defense strategy with Ootbi by Object First, because when you're thinking about the quick recoveries, if you lose a few VMs or a cluster and you need to fire everything back up on-prem, we've got your back. We've got immutability out of the box. It's turnkey with 0 access to root, like we've already touched on. So literally it's drop Ootbi in, start running your backups to it. You've got all the performance that you need at your fingertips. You've got a hardened infrastructure right there with our box before it even leaves the factory. And you also have full support from our awesome support staff that are partnered with Veeam. So again, it's really the best storage for Veeam for a reason.
I couldn't have said it better myself, Matt. We often say when you think about Veeam, think about Object First, and out of the box immutability is how you do that. So definitely take advantage of all the tips we've given you here today. Run through them, like really put everything we've said through its paces and make sure you're checking all those boxes. And if you want to upgrade your storage along the way, hey, we're here to have that conversation with you.
Absolutely. We'll see you guys on the next one. Thanks for tuning in.